Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly chat about local history. I'm Robert Lowell Goller. Thanks for joining us. As always, appreciate the support of this project. This week, I wanted to talk, continuing on our presidential theme, as we've been talking about the new administration. The new administration's been in the news, an inauguration day in the recent election. Um, and one of the things that popped into my head as I was researching is we all know that East Aurora has a lot of presidential connections. We actually have a lot of, I talked about Horace Boyce, who went on to become governor of Iowa. Was born on Boyce Road and then went on to become the governor of Iowa and then ran for president. Actually came pretty close to it. Was a runner-up at the Democratic National Convention. Uh, and of course, we had Millard Fillmore, probably the most famous presidential connection that we have here. He lived here between 1820 and 1830 with a couple years away. His family stayed here, and his house, of course, is still on Shear Avenue as a museum run by the Historical Society. And then Grover Cleveland is probably another one that is not up there with Millard Fillmore when it comes to East Aurora presidential connections, but he definitely came to East Aurora. He was, of course, mayor of Buffalo. He was sheriff of Erie County before that, though, and he probably most certainly came to East Aurora. We believe he stayed at the Globe Hotel, or at least dined there. And another really solid connection, on paper connection to the village, to the town, is that he owned the land at the corner of Davis Road and what is Route 28 today, so Davis and Quaker Roads, the southwestern corner. He's on old maps, so we know for a fact that Grover Cleveland, and then there's follow-up documentation in the newspapers referring to that land as the former sheriff's land. So we know that the Grover Cleveland on the maps is the Grover Cleveland. So we know those connections that Grover Cleveland would have come to East Aurora as a future president, and that Millard Fillmore would have been here as both a future president and a former president. Because his family lived here, his father actually lived the rest of his life here on the farm on Olean Road, and then he, in 1854, uh, moved into a house with his second wife on East Main Street. So we know those presidential connections. However, I was wondering, have we ever had a sitting U.S. president come to East Aurora? So has a president who is occupying the White House step foot in East Aurora? And so through a bunch of research, and actually I want to point out again this wonderful book, and sorry I have all these papers in it to hold the place as bookmarks, but Buffalo and the Presidents. I've talked about this book before. It's a great book about all the presidential connections to the city and Erie County, including a great list of probably the most comprehensive list of all the presidential visits to the Buffalo area by future presidents, sitting presidents, and former presidents. So I started with that, but then I dug through. I just did digital searches through the newspapers of President and East Aurora. Um, and I've come to the conclusion after some exhaustive research. I don't usually it was more research than I usually am accustomed to before writing about a topic. But I wanted to make sure I did as much research as possible to get the answer I was looking for. And the answer is yes, a sitting U.S. president has visited East Aurora, and it probably has only happened once. And yes, it was Millard Fillmore. And I'll put a link to the East Aurora Advertiser's website page of where you can read the article with all the details. But through a process of elimination, I found out, I'm pretty sure that this one visit by a sitting U.S. president occurred from Saturday, May 17th, 1851 to Monday, May 19th of 1851. And what happened is Millard Fillmore had become president the previous summer. Zachary Taylor died in office, as we all know, and Millard Fillmore, as vice president, became president. Well, he was big into railroads and the extension of railroads, but also there was the opening of this railroad that was going across New York State, and he was invited as president, and it was a pretty big deal, and it was a great way for the president and his cabinet politically to see the constituents, to go out on a campaign trail of sorts. So he was invited by the railroad company, the New York and Erie Railroad, to be exact, to take a ride across New York State from New York City area across the southern tier to Dunkirk. And so most of his cabinet, a big portion of his cabinet joined him, the railroad executives. So this was a very, very big deal. And it was the inaugural ride across the state. And so they stopped at every single stop they could possibly town along the way. And at each place there were speeches and flags and banners and a lot of hoopla, as it would be the case if a sitting president was coming through your community. Not much has changed in that regard since 1851. And so he ends up in Dunkirk. The city of Buffalo had invited him to come, so his old hometown. He lived here till 1830 and then moved to Buffalo, and then went on to become the vice president and the president from there. And so Buffalo was, of course, really excited to have the sitting U.S. president from Buffalo coming back to the city. So by steamer, they took him up Lake Erie, and his arrival in Buffalo was a very big deal. They had artillery salutes. This happened in a lot of communities along the way. A big parade, and I talk about it in the article, the details of all the people who showed up, how the signs, banners across the street, and then they had a big rally for him where there were a bunch of speeches, and he stayed at a hotel that was called the Mansion House. And so he had been for several days on a train, and at each stop, he had started off with a big dinner, and actually in Dunkirk they had a big reception, and then Buffalo went over the top, and he was actually one of the newspaper reports, and I dug through all the newspapers that I could to get a sense of what was happening along this tour of the railroad, and I ended up going down this big rabbit hole. However, I found some interesting things that gave me perspective to what his visit to Buffalo and then to East Aurora would have been. And so he was talking so much that one of the newspaper reporters said that he was hoarse, that his voice didn't carry very much because he had been talking so much, and by the time he got to Buffalo and done with all the Buffalo things, he probably was extremely exhausted. So on Saturday, after all this happened on Friday, he rode to East Aurora in a horse and carriage, most likely. There was no train at the time. East Aurora didn't get its first train through the village until after the Civil War. This was 1851. So he would have come to East Aurora, and he spent the Sabbath with his father, and at the time it would be his stepmother. His stepmother's name was Eunice. So the newspapers gave very detailed accounts of what was happening at every single stop along the way. In Dunkirk at the end, and then in Buffalo. Like, he couldn't sneeze without the newspaper reporters writing it down and putting it in the newspaper. But his visit to what was known then as Aurora, and to visit his father and spend the Sabbath, was only a couple sentences in the paper. And actually they kind of announced just kind of the goings of the president. Where is everybody in the cabinet? And they said a lot of the cabinet members went up to Niagara Falls, and that the president came to East Aurora with Nathan Hall, who was his postmaster general. And the reason Nathan Hall joined him was because he was from the town of Wales and actually had worked with, was a longtime friend of Millard Fillmore's and had worked with him in his early days here in East Aurora. So Nathan Hall would have been coming back to his hometown, some friends as well. So he joined Millard Fillmore. So all that was included, but there was no discussion of what happened in East Aurora while the president was here. So it seems they treated it like a private rest time for the president, sort of like when the current president would go to Camp David or something. The media is still there, though. That's the thing. So that's what's different from today. Even though they give him some sort of privacy, the media is still there in case anything happens. This seems like the media just stayed in Buffalo and let Millard Fillmore come to East Aurora It was a different time, of course, before the Civil War, before the United States was in the position that it is today. So the media attention to the president, they did give him a little privacy, and so the media just said that he was spending the Sabbath with his father here in East Aurora. Uh, because they didn't go into detail, and because East Aurora, we did not have a newspaper at the time, which drives me nuts because I would love a an account of his visit to the village, not just the Buffalo newspaper saying that he came here and just leaving it as like two sentences. But we didn't have a weekly newspaper. The East Aurora Advertiser did not start till 1872, so about 20 years later. And then the previous newspaper to that was the 1830s, so about 15 years before the visit. So we lacked a community newspaper. I checked our journals and our diaries in the collection at the town historian's office, and I could not find anything that would have from that time period. I just kind of wanted to know if anybody, if waited for the president to come to the village. So I've had to make a few assumptions about his visit, and my assumption is, given the time period, yes, he was the president of the United States, but they would have given him privacy, and him, especially when he was observing the Sabbath, the Sunday, and coming to visit his father. So my assumption is he came into town very low key, probably didn't, maybe had a welcoming committee, but probably not a big parade. Almost assuredly no artillery salutes like happened in Buffalo. Definitely a private, quiet weekend with his father. He most likely stayed with his father on Olean Road. So the farmhouse is still there. A lot of the buildings are not, but at the corner of Olean Road and Lapham Road is the Fillmore farm. It actually took that name for several years after the Fillmore family was no longer there. And the president probably stayed there with his father. And we know he arrived there Saturday afternoon because that's what the newspapers told us, and that he was back in Buffalo, spent Sunday, so Saturday evening, Sunday, and then was back in Buffalo late Monday morning. So between Saturday, May 17th of 1851 and Monday morning of May 19th, we had a sitting U.S. president in the village of East Aurora. And that is really the only time I could find. We did have a couple other instances where a future president or a former president visited us here in the village. Of course, Millard Fillmore, even Martin Nowak, who wrote this book about the presidents, he doesn't even list Grover Cleveland or Millard Fillmore's times as former and future presidents because they were so numerous. They lived here. They did all sorts of things here. So Millard Fillmore was obviously here as a future president, and he was also here as a former president visiting his father, who lived the rest of his life here. But there were some other presidents that we can trace to the village of East Aurora, including one former president. It's and I outline it in the article that I wrote. It's a unique a visit by a former president, but it was William McKinley. When he was shot, after he was assassinated in Buffalo, his funeral train came through East Aurora, and so had passed away, and so the remains of him, his remains came through East Aurora on a funeral train. There was newspaper accounts that the village knew this was happening, and the school children they all I believe it was a Sunday, but people all gathered around the tracks and paid tribute to the fallen president. So that a former president, in a way, came through East Aurora with William McKinley's funeral train. Before that, a couple months before that, the East Aurora Advertiser, and I got really excited because the East Aurora Advertiser was talking about a visit to East Aurora by Vice President Teddy Roosevelt. And it said it was in May of 1901, and he was helping dedicate the Pan American Exposition, which is what brought President McKinley to Buffalo several months later. But he was opening the exposition in Buffalo, and the East Aurora Advertiser had quoted a schedule that was put out earlier in the week saying that the Vice President, Teddy Roosevelt, was going to come visit the Roycroft shops here in East Aurora on that Thursday. So I'm like, oh, great, a vice president and a future president visited East Aurora. It'd be noteworthy. And I went and looked in the East Aurora Advertiser. There was nothing else printed about it. And then I went into the Buffalo newspapers, and there was nothing about a visit to the Roycroft other than the schedule earlier in the week. And in fact, they outlined his detailed itinerary of what he actually did on that Thursday as he toured around the grounds. He watched some performances, and then the next day he went directly to Geneseo. So obviously the plans changed, and he didn't apparently come to East Aurora. So we missed that opportunity to have a future president visit the village. And then finally, George H.W. Bush was a classmate of Seymour Knox III. And he apparently stayed at the Knox estate. And there are some varying accounts as to when this happened. And in the article, I had said that years before he became president. Well, it is believed that he might have visited. A couple sources say that he visited earlier. And then there's some sources saying that he visited while as a former president the estate. But they're very muddy sources. And what I love about when I write, one of the things I love about when I write these articles is I get feedback from people and more information. So the article gets put out there, people read it, thank you for doing that, and then I get contacted and say, oh, did you know that, George H.W. Bush visited here or on this date? And sometimes people's memories aren't clear about these things, so I take that information down and try to track it down. I am going to do that, but we do know, pretty sure, that George H.W. Bush visited the Knox estate because he was a classmate college classmate of Seymour Knox III. But how many times and exactly when, I'm still going to flesh out. And when I take this article and turn it into a chapter of a future book, I'll hopefully have that all fleshed out. But I appreciate that feedback because I wouldn't have gotten that feedback unless someone who was reading the article that I wrote for the Advertiser last week. So that's what we believe is our connections to future and former presidents. Also, there, as I noted at the end of the article, people in East Aurora would take. We've had probably about 24 visits by sitting U.S. presidents to Buffalo, and East Aurorans would go up to Buffalo to visit. Take part in those visits. Presidential visits are a big deal. As you remember, a couple years ago, I think it was President Obama came to Buffalo, and the site of Air Force One landing at the airport. It just is a big deal, and that is something that has not changed over the years. The excitement of having a sitting president come to your town is a very big deal. So the way they got here and the circumstances under which they got here, Millard Fillmore came by a steamship to Buffalo, and then a horse and buggy to East Aurora, and then of course modern presidents come by Air Force One and the Beast, their secure limousine. But that excitement around a presidential visit hasn't really changed. So I thought that was interesting. So in a nutshell, answer the question: yes, a sitting president has visited East Aurora, and it's probably only happened once, and it was Millard Fillmore. Again, thank you for joining me for these weekly chats about local history. I really appreciate the support of this project. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know, either in the comments or send me a private message. And some of you stop me in the grocery store. That's okay, too. Again, I am Robert Lowell Goller. These videos, I am the town and village historian, but these videos and a lot of my research are not officially connected to my duties as town and village historian. Again, thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time. And as always, thank you for keeping history alive. Take care.